Shalom, everybody. James Trim here, and here we are ready to begin through the book of Enoch, lesson 4. Now, you may notice some change in my appearance since lesson 3, and that's because the first 3 lessons of Through the Book of Enoch were originally produced 6 years ago. And then we discontinued after lesson 3 due to lack of interest at the time. Fortunately, interest in the book of Enoch has skyrocketed in recent times, and there's a great deal of demand for information about the book of Enoch. And we've gotten a lot of requests lately to pick back up and finish out the Through the Book of Enoch series. So my first thought was, well, I want to look back and see what I did in lessons 1 through 3 and see if they can be preserved or if I need to do something better. And the answer is no. Actually, lessons 1 through 3 worked out just fine. So we preserved them, we reused them, and we're now ready to start lesson 4 right where we left off. And in this particular lesson, we're going to smash some common Book of Enoch myths. And rather than spoil the surprise, we will simply knock these out as we go. So we're going to be picking up in chapter 14, I believe, verse 7. Let's see here. I think we ended in verse 7. We're going to pick up in verse 8. And I'll actually start in verse 7 just to be sure, and also for a little bit of review and carryover. And we're actually going to start by smashing one of the myths of the Book of Enoch. So starting in verse 7, because your petition on their behalf shall not be granted, nor yet on your own. Let me switch. I'm using the old edition here. Let me grab the new one. It shouldn't be any different, but if there are any differences, I want to be reading in the version that you hopefully have. By the way, we're using this, which is maybe reversed in the video, the Book of Enoch Study Edition. And you may have this, which is my old edition, which is fine too, but it doesn't have as much information in it, and it's formatted differently. And definitely you want to download the handouts, which will be in a PDF available. And if you're looking at this in the right place, there will be a link to the PDF, so you can just print them out for yourself. The handouts are really key to this class. Okay. Chapter 14, verse 7, because your petition on their behalf, Enoch has been making a petition on behalf of the fallen angels, and it says, because your petition on their behalf shall not be granted, nor yet on your own, even though you petition and ask and speak all the words contained in the writing which I have written. And the vision was shown to me thus. Verse 8, behold, this is the key word, and the vision was shown to me thus. And then verse 8 begins, behold, in the vision clouds invited me, and a mist summoned me, and the course of the stars were shouting to me, and the lightnings and the thunderings and hastened me, and the winds in the vision caused me to fly, and lifted me upward, and bore me to enter into heaven. Very important, the way this Enoch's journey here starts out. It is, how many times are we told it's a vision? Like 4 times there. I used to have a college professor that said, hey, if I say something more than once, it might show up on the test. Here we've got 4 times that we're told that this is a vision. It's very important because there are those out there that interpret the rest of the book of Watchers, and this vision continues through the end of the book of Watchers portion of the text. There are those who have interpreted the vision literally and ignored those words that it says like 4 times that it was a vision. So let's talk about what a vision is. In fact, this vision has, as we will find out in our study, many parallels to Daniel chapter 7. And in Daniel chapter 7, let's go there real quickly here. Daniel 7. So I'm turning to it, so that gives you a minute to turn to it as well. This is one of the reasons we do these handouts, is I like people to be able to see things for themselves. So in Daniel 7, it says starting in the first verse, in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed, and he wrote of the dream, and he told the sum of the matters. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the 4 winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And then he describes seeing 4 fantastic beasts rise up from the sea, an eagle with wings and 4-headed leopard, etc. The point being here that this is in Daniel 7 is a vision. It is not textual evidence to prove the existence of 4-headed leopards or the real world existence of lions with eagle's wings. Likewise, in Acts chapter 10, and these are just a couple of examples, there's examples all through the scriptures. Acts chapter 10, in Acts chapter 10, Kepha, Peter, has a vision. And in this vision, he sees a sheet with unkosher animals on it. By the way, we'll find out later, this vision is drawing on material from the book of Enoch itself and the so-called animal apocalypse section, where the animals represent races of people, okay? And but it says here in, let's see, here's a verse. So it doesn't actually, I don't guess does it say here it was a vision? I thought it said it was a vision. But it was clearly a vision. He was in a trance, and it was clearly a vision that he sees. Maybe elsewhere he refers to it as a vision. And then we're told that the vision, that the animals had symbolic representation, and that there was a meaning to this vision that had symbolic representation. Same thing in Daniel 7. In Daniel 7, the creatures that Daniel sees in his vision rising from the sea aren't real. They're symbolic. So it's fair then to understand that the things that we will be reading about, starting with chapter 14, verse 7, and going forward through the rest of the book of Watchers and Daniel's fantastic journey through the heavens and the fantastic places that he sees in a vision are not real. They are symbolic. At least they are not of this world. They are symbolic. The heavenly world is symbolic. In fact, this is why we read in the Torah and later in Hebrews that the tabernacle was made after a pattern, because the tabernacle in the heavenlies was patterned. The tabernacle we have on earth is symbolic, is made after the tabernacle in the heavenlies, which is symbolic, actually. Okay, has symbolism. And so that's the case here. We're going to be, so why am I going through all this? Well, there are people who have um, created whole doctrines around things that Enoch sees in this vision on the false premise that he is describing things of this world and this reality. And um, one of those is that the flat earth people have embraced the book of Enoch as supposedly teaching flat earth. And actually, if you, as we'll find out if you read the book of Enoch, it describes the tree of life as being in the extreme east and in the extreme west, meaning that if you go either direction, eventually you get to the same place. So it doesn't teach a flat earth at all. But not only that, the material that they're using to come up with this flat earth idea is actually described as a vision. And so it no more teaches the real world existence of a flat earth than it teaches the real world existence of lions with wings and four-headed leopards. It is the same error as misinterpreting Acts chapter 10 as actually referring to the animals themselves rather than understanding that it was a vision and that the animals were only symbolic of various classes of the Gentiles, basically. Okay. So that's very important as we're heading into this. This is not. There are also those who come up with astronomical data or an astronomical models based on some of this information, which they use for various types of calendars. And we'll deal with some of this later also with the astronomical section. And they ignore the fact that this is, in fact, from this point forward in at least the Book of Watchers section, a vision. Okay, so let's actually look at this vision and some of the symbolism. Behold, in the vision, clouds invited me, and a mist summoned me, and the course of the stars were shouting to me, and the lightnings and the thunderings hastened me, and the winds in the vision caused me to fly, and lifted me upward, and bore me into heaven. And I went in until I drew near to a wall, which is built of crystals and surrounded by tongues of fire, and it began to frighten me. Now you have to understand, tongues of fire is a Hebrew idiom referring to the little bits, the tongues, if you will, of fire coming up from a fire, okay, lapping into the air. Okay. Verse 10, and I went into the tongues of fire and drew near to a great house, which was built of crystals, and the walls of the house were like a tessellated floor of ice. Its ceiling was like the path of the stars, and its lightnings between them were fiery cherubim, and their heaven was clear as water. A flaming fire surrounded all the walls, and its gates blazed with fire. And I entered into that house, and it was not as fire, it was hot as fire, and cold as ice. So we have these opposites here. And there was no delights of life therein. Fear covered me, and trembling got hold onto me. And as I quaked and trembled, I fell upon my face. And I beheld a vision, and lo, there was a second house, greater than the former, and the entire gate stood open before me, and it was built of flames of fire, and in every respect it so excelled in splendor and magnificence and extent that I cannot describe to you its splendor and its extent. And its floor was of fire above, and it were lightnings and paths, a path of stars, and its ceiling also was flaming fire. So these two houses are inverse to one another. One is reminded of the Star of David and the interlocking triangles that are in opposition to one another. Um, and are understood by some to represent the opposing elements, even of fire and water. So here you have fire and ice, and the two houses, one within the other, are also inverse from one another, and they're inverse combinations of opposites. So what we get here really is that the throne that he's about to approach is this harmony of opposing forces. A very basic concept in Judaism, and in the Zohar, which we'll talk about later. The very strong idea of the balance between the harmony between chesed, for example, mercy and loving kindness, and Geverah, justice and severity, and that Elohim takes these two opposing forces and harmonizes them in the middle pillar of the Godhead, if you will, which is the Word, which we're about to meet. Let's go to verse 18. And I looked and saw therein a lofty throne. Its appearance was as crystal, and the wheels thereof as the shining sun, and there was the vision of cherubim. And from underneath the throne came streams of flaming fire, so that I could not look thereon. This is the same thing that we read in Daniel chapter 7, verse 10. In fact, other throne room scenes that we see in the beginning, it's called a Ma'aseh Merkava, an account of the divine throne chariot. It's called the throne chariot because it has wheels, are we see in the first two chapters of Ezekiel and in Daniel chapter 7. Okay. Now, we could say, if we were skeptics, that Enoch is drawing upon Ezekiel and Daniel. But the whole point of this study is to treat, at least for argument's sake, if not for reality, the book of Enoch as authentic, and that it was actually written by Enoch, edited by, and redacted by Noah into a final edition, and so we're going to treat it as authentic. So for that purpose, then we would actually say that the first two chapters of Ezekiel and Daniel chapter 7 are making use of the book of Enoch, or even better, that they're seeing Ezekiel and Daniel saw the same thing that Enoch saw, and they're describing it in different ways, but also with being influenced by the accounts of one another, or at least by the accounts of Enoch. All right. And he says, I could not look thereon. This reminds us of the idea that we read of in the Torah, Exodus 33:20, where that no man can see me and live. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more brightly than the sun, was whiter than much snow. None of the angels could enter and could hold his face by reason of the magnificence and glory, and no flesh could behold him. The flaming fire was round about him, a great fire stood before him, and none around could draw near him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. And this throne, this flame, streams of fire that come from under the throne, we're going to read about them more later in this study, but let's not forget that they're there because they will be revisited. And what we have here is in Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days in Daniel 7. This is important because this is the launching point. Kind of put a pin here, if you will, because from this throne room scene, then we're going to have Enoch's journey that we're going to be going over, and then in the rest of the Book of Watchers. But then when we get to the so-called Book of Parables, we're actually going to be concentrating on the meaning of this vision, this Ma'aseh Merkava, this account of the throne chariot, and this being the Ancient of Days that is on the throne, and another being that we're about to read about here. The flaming fire was okay. Verse 23, yet he needed no counselor, and the most set apart ones who were near to him did not leave by night nor depart from him. And until then, I had been prostrated on my face trembling, and Yahweh called me with his own mouth and said to me, come here, Enoch, or Enoch, and hear my word. This is very important. The word is a very important concept in Judaism. We'll come back to that here in a minute. And one of the set apart ones came to me and waked me, and he made me rise up and approach the door, and I bowed my face downwards. So the word is, so we have the Ancient of Days. Enoch is brought before the Ancient of Days, and then he is it's not called that here, but it will be in the Book of Parables, and it is in Daniel 7. And Daniel 7, where the Son of Man is this second figure before, and we have plural thrones that are mentioned, that is before the Ancient of Days. It comes before the Ancient of Days. Here we have the Ancient of Days imploring Enoch to come forward and hear from his word. And the word is in Aramaic Memra, and in Hebrew it would be Devar, and in Greek it would be Logos. And the word in Jewish thought, it appears in the Targums a lot, is the it's the immanent aspect of Elohim that permeates the universe. It's the image of Elohim. It is the rational mind of Elohim that permeates the universe. It is this finite image of Elohim versus the infinite Elohim that is beyond comprehension. Okay, so here we have the two figures, the Word. Of course, we read about the Word in Yochanan chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with Elohim, and the Word was Elohim. And then the Word becomes flesh, i.e. Yeshua the Messiah. And all that's going to become very clear and when we get to the Book of Parables. But here we just have these two figures. We have the Ancient of Days on his throne, and we have the figure, we have the Word, which the Ancient of Days calls Enoch before to hear. Chapter 15, and he answered, and he said to me, and I heard his voice, fear not, Enoch, you righteous man, the scribe of righteousness, approach hither and hear my voice. And now we get to the first handout, the scribe of righteousness, Enoch the scribe. So our first handout is Enoch the scribe, 1 Enoch 15:1. Enoch was described as a scribe in chapter 12, verse 4 earlier. I don't remember if I mentioned that 6 years ago when we were covering 12:4, but it's there. He's also called scribe in Jubilees chapter 4, verses 17 and 20. The ancient Hebrews identified Enoch with the planet that we call Mercury, and we will visit that more in depth later. but they identified him with the planet that we call Mercury, and which the Talmud refers to as, quote, the scribe of the sun, S-U-N. Babylonian Talmud Shabbat 156a. He who is born under Mercury will be retentive memory and wise, be of retentive memory and wise. What is the reason? Because Mercury, is the sun's scribe, or the scribe of the sun. Okay. The Egyptian god Thoth, or Tot, literally, Thoth, Hermes, was known to the ancients as the scribe of the gods, or the messenger of the gods, and was associated with the planet that we know as Mercury. The Roman god Mercury was a slight revision of the Greek god Hermes, which was associated with the Egyptian god Thoth. And all that will come in more important in some later passages in the book of Enoch, because it's helpful to recall that the Thoth, the Egyptian Thoth, Greek Hermes, and Roman Mercury traditions were actually corruptions of Enoch. That's why, by the way, Mercury and Hermes are pictured with wings on the feet, because Enoch walked with God. Okay, all these things are corruptions that paganism corrupted the truth. All right. So chapter 15 continues in verse 2, and go say to the watchers of heaven who have sent you to intercede for them, you should intercede for men and not men for you. Should be the other way around. You should be interceding for men. What is it that Enoch is sitting here interceding for you for? Wherefore have you left the highest set apart in eternal heaven, and lain with heaven, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons. This is what Jude 1:6 refers to as, or is it Kepha that say that they left their first estate. Verse 4, and though you were set apart, spiritual living, the eternal life, you have defiled yourself with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh, and as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those do who die and perish. Therefore I have given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, thus nothing might be wanting to them on earth. But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal in all generations of the world. And therefore I have not appointed wives for you. For as for the spiritual ones of the heavens, in heaven is their dwelling. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits in the flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. This is an important key verse you may want to make note of as a proof text, or a so-called proof text and evidence text forever. This is the origin of evil spirits, and in fact, the Book of Enoch reveals to us several classes of demonic entities, and one of the fallen angels themselves. But there are only 200 of those. Then their offspring, we will find out in their judgment in the flood, which is to come. They have no place to go. They're not welcome in heaven. They can't, they have no longer any bodies because they died. But after their death in the flood, their spirits had nowhere to go, and so they remained here. Verse 9, evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from men, and from the set apart watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. And as for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling. But as for the spirits of the earth, which were born upon the earth, on the earth shall be their dwelling. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst and cause offenses. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and against women, because they have proceeded from them. And these are the evil spirits that we normally deal with on a regular basis in the sense of demon. What we normally call demons are usually these entities. They are not the Nephilim, typically. They're not the Nephilim themselves. There are only 200 of the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the fallen angels. Okay, so we have a second class of demonic entities here that are the spirits of the fallen, of the giant children of the fallen angels. For chapter 16, from the days of the slaughter and destruction and death of the giants, from the souls of whose flesh the spirits having gone forth shall destroy without incurring judgment. Thus shall they destroy until the day of the consummation, the great judgment, in which the age shall be consummated over the watchers and the godless. Yea, ye shall be wholly consummated. Verse 2, and now, as to the watchers who have sent you to intercede for them, who have been aforetime in heaven, say to them, you have been in heaven, but all the mysteries had not yet been revealed to you. I was holding some back. It's very important ones. And you knew worthless ones, and these in the hardness of your hearts you have made known to the women, and those mysteries, women and men, work much evil on earth. And we read about these in the previous chapters. So they brought some secrets of heaven, but they were relatively worthless ones by comparison to the ones that that they were not given. And this brings us to 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 7 through 8. Let's look that up. 1 Corinthians 2, 7 through 8. But we speak the wisdom of Elohim in a mystery, even the hidden wisdom which Elohim ordained before the world unto our glory, which none of the princes of this world knew. For had they known it, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. So that's the identity of the Messiah, and the whole plan there was withheld from them. They didn't have that information, and had the demonic entities had that information, they would not have fallen for the trap, if you will. And this is what the book of Enoch is alluding to here. They didn't know the whole story. There was some information they didn't have, and that information turned out to be their undoing. Verse 4, say to them, therefore, you have no shalom. Now we get to chapter 17. Chapter 17 is where we start to it's another example of material. Let me back up. Let me say something here. A few months ago, I was banned from a large Book of Enoch discussion group online. The reason was that I would, from time to time, quote the Zohar. Now, if you watch these studies, you will find out that it's absurd to ask people to discuss the Book of Enoch and prohibit them from referencing the Zohar, at least if they are to do so intelligently. The Book of Enoch and the Zohar go hand in hand. The book of Enoch was known to the authors of the Zohar. The authors of the Zohar say so specifically. They reference the book of Enoch by name. They are aware of the material in the book of Enoch, as you have seen in the previous parts of this study, when they reference the information about Azazel and Shemichazah and the fallen angels and how they taught sorcery and the whole 9 yards. So it's all in there. Now that's very interesting because the book of Enoch was lost to all but Ethiopia in the 4th century. It remained part of the canon of the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, a very obscure part of the world in those days, until the the very late 1700s, when Robert the Bruce, I think that was his name, an explorer brought the I may have some historical characters' names confused there, embarrassingly. But anyway, when an explorer, I forget his name, brought them went to Ethiopia and obtained copies of the Ethiopic text and brought it back to Europe. And that was in the very late 1700s. And Richard Lawrence published the first English translation in the very late 1700s, maybe the very early 1800s. And then R.H. Charles produced a much better translation a few years later, still in the fairly early to mid 1800s. But the bottom line is that the book of Enoch the material of the book of Enoch was largely unknown in Europe in the Middle Ages. Now, the Zohar claims to have been written in the very early 2nd century, I believe, late 1st century, mostly, I think actually the 2nd century, early 2nd century CE. But skeptics claim that the Zohar was written in the Middle Ages. And that simply doesn't fit because the Zohar contains knowledge of the book of Enoch, and that would not have been available to Jews in the Middle Ages in Europe. At that time, the book of Enoch was known only in Ethiopic to the Ethiopic Orthodox Church, which had virtually no contact with Europe. And it's not just the account of Shemichazah and Azazel, it's material all through the book of Enoch that I'm talking about. And so in chapter 17, we're about to cover the river of fire, which is actually referenced directly in verse 5. And we have a handout for that. Yes, river of fire, second handout. River of fire, 1st Enoch 17. And this will refer back to Daniel 7, 9 through 10 and the fire. And actually, it's not referring back to material parallel to Daniel 7, to Enoch chapter 14 and the fire, streams of fire coming from under the throne. Okay, chapter 17, verse 1, and they took and brought me to a place in which those who were there were like flaming fire. And when they wished, they appeared as men. And they brought me to the place of darkness and to a mountain, the point of whose summit reached to heaven. This parallels, I don't know that it's in the handout. You'd have to study the Zohar and read the material before and after the Zohar. I mean, in the paragraphs leading up to and the river of fire discussion. But the Zohar teaches that the earthly Eden and the heavenly paradise are connected by the pillar of fire. It's like an elevator that brings souls up, and that parallel. And it talks about Eden is a point. The garden is a point in Eden that is connected to a parallel point in the heavenly paradise. And that parallels what this is talking about here. Verse 3, and I saw the places of the luminaries and the treasures of the stars and the thunders in the uttermost depths, where were a fiery bow and arrows and their quiver and a fiery sword and all the lightnings. And they took me to the living waters and to the fire of the west, which receives every setting of the sun. And I came to a river of fire, in which the fire flows like water and discharges itself into the great sea towards the west. In other words, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, and you have a blazing sunset over the Great Sea, which in Israel you're looking out at the Mediterranean Sea, is what they're referring to here. Okay, in the Holy Land, not in Israel even yet, but the Holy Land. I saw the great rivers, verse 6, I saw the great rivers and came to the great river. This is referring to Eden. Eden in Genesis chapter 1 has a river that flows out and forms four rivers that water all the earth. So it says, verse 6, I saw great rivers and came to the great river and to the great darkness and went to the place where no flesh walks. Sheol, basically, the underworld, if you will. The Greeks also had a legend of a river that separated our world from the underworld. And they also saw the pillars of Hades as at the very extreme end of the Mediterranean, where the Atlantic Sea flows in. Verse 7, I saw the mountains of the darkness of winter in the place from which all waters of the deep flow. The place from Eden, which is in Sheol, has been cast in Sheol, according to Ezekiel. He saw the garden where the water flows from, the waters of life. The waters of life that feed life to the whole world, just as the sun and the river of fire feeds life to the whole world, in that the energy that gives life, that vivifies life, comes from the sun, because the sun is converted by plants into food, and that food, fruits and vegetables and nuts and such, are then consumed by animals, who then get that indirect energy and convert it into energy and burn it. All that energy ultimately comes from the sun. It's the river of life. It's this east to west path of the sun. And I saw the mountains of the darkness of winter in the place from which all the waters of the deep flow. That's Eden, the Garden of Eden. And I saw the mouths of all the rivers of the earth and the mouth of the deep. So from there we can get both the idea of the Garden of Eden. Okay, we can also get the idea, perhaps by parallel, of the so-called pillars of Hades, where water flows into the Mediterranean Sea from the Atlantic, from sort of a great abyss out there. Perhaps. Maybe that's a corruption, and maybe that's where the Greeks got their ideas from. So let's talk about this river of fire and see how the Zohar and the book of Enoch go hand in hand here. The Zohar mentions this river of fire. Okay. Now it is mentioned, by the way, briefly in the Talmud and in the Midrash Rabbah, but there's not. It's not really fleshed out like it is in the Zohar. So Zohar, Volume 1, page 201. I have actually quoted here. When the sun leaves this world, ... I leave some out. There is the ever flowing river of fire, which all souls have to pass and to bathe in. And who is he that can face it and pass through it without fear? But the soul of the righteous passes without fear and stands in his holy place. And the man who has performed charity in this world, having given of his substance to charitable objects, as such a one is written, and he shall pass over, that is, he shall pass through that region without fear, and a herald will proclaim before that soul, and though I have afflicted thee, I will afflict thee no more. Nahum 1:12. For whoever is worthy to pass through that region is exempt from any further ordeal whatsoever. Then there's a much longer treatment, and I didn't want to turn this into a Zohar class. People do a Zohar class someday, but I couldn't really turn this into a Zohar class. There's a whole section of the Zohar that starts around in volume 2, around page 209, and it goes all the way through page 211b. And it leads up and it sets the stage for this whole river of fire thing. And it draws a parallel between the Eden and the Garden of Eden as the point in Eden from which there was a pillar of fire that connected the earthly paradise to the terrestrial paradise to the celestial paradise. And in the terrestrial paradise, you have you have living waters that flow out and spread out into 4 rivers, and those 4 rivers of water bring water to the earth. But in parallel, in the heavenly celestial version, you have a river of fire, and that river of fire is, I guess, somewhat inverse because it starts with it originates from 4, and then becomes a single river, and that river, those 4 rivers of fire, actually originate from the 4 cherubim, who are identified also in this section of the Zohar with the 4 angels, Raphael, Uriel, Gabriel, and Michael. And 2 of them are given different names, but if you research it, you'll find that those are actually alternate names. Like Uriel is called Nuriel, and I think it's Michael that's called Boiel, I think. But these are actually common alternate names for those angels in some of the Kabbalistic writings and the Zohar. So these 4 angels are holding up the throne, the 4 cherubim that we read about so often in Ezekiel and in Revelation, and they're holding up the throne, and because they're holding up the throne and exerting, and remember, this is all symbolic. This is a vision, it's symbolic. This is all symbolic material. They're perspiring fire, and this fire of perspiration from each of the 4 then is 4 streams of fire coming out from the throne and forming this river of fire. And this river of fire is this river through which souls are purified in their journey to the heavenly paradise. Okay. And so we get to again, pages of Zohar I really couldn't cover, except just briefly there. So Zohar chapter 2, book 2, volume 2, 211b, page 211b. The garden is an emanation of the point called Eden. The heads of the living creatures, every one having 4 faces, that of a lion, an ox, an eagle, and that of a man, the latter embracing them all, as it says, in the likeness of their faces was that of a man, Ezekiel 1:10, are identical with the 4 heads of the rivers in Genesis 2:10. And it is they who support the divine throne, and out of the weight of that burden, they oozed perspiration, and out of that perspiration was formed the river of fire, the Nahur Dinur, which means river of fire or river of light. It can be translated either way. Of which it is written, a fiery stream issued and came forth from before him. Thousands of thousands ministered unto him, Daniel 7:10, and it's also in the book of Enoch, chapter 1 Enoch 14. The souls of men before ascending into paradise are immersed in that river of fire. There they are purged without being consumed, as it was with the soul, as with a garment made of the skin of a salamander. And there's a note here from, this is from the Sonsino version. There's a translator's note referring, it says that salamander is a reptile to be believed to be engendered in fire so that its skin was fireproof. That was an old tradition, even common in folk tale back in even the early 20th century. It's false, but, and also it's a little accurate here when it calls it a reptile. Salamander is actually an amphibian, but such a garment, by reason of its having its origin in fire, can only be cleansed in fire, fire alone having the power to purge it of its impurities. Excuse me. For the soul indeed originated in fire. By the way, this is where Tolkien, I think, got his some of his ideas. For the soul indeed originated in fire, being an emanation from the divine throne, of which it is said, his throne was fiery flames. Daniel 7:9. So in order to be purged of its impurities, it has to pass through fire. Thus fire alone has the virtue of consuming every pollution in the soul and making it emerge pure and white. The second page of this handout points out that the Greeks had a myth of a river called, I'm not even going to pronounce this Greek name, but it's there in your handout. Excuse me, literally fire flaming. Plato described it as stream of fire which coils around the earth and flows into the depths of Tartarus. Plato, in his work Phaedo, page 112b, or reference 112b. I'm not an expert on this, so I don't know how that reference works, but it's 112b. I will tell you that Tartarus is the Greek word that's used in the Greek of 2 Peter 2:4, where it's translated in the KJV hell, and it describes the place where the fallen angels were kept in chains. The Greeks believed that Tartarus was the place of confinement for the Titans. There's a lot of parallels between the Titans that were a corruption of the fallen angels, and then their descendants, the evil spirits, were the Greek gods were corruptions of those. And by the way, in the Septuagint, the word Tartarus is used to translate the Hebrew word takti, which refers to the lowest recesses, if you will. Okay. So with that in mind, I'll quickly reread chapter 17, starting verse 4. They looked to the living waters and to the fire of the west, which receives every setting of the sun. And I came to a river of fire, in which the fire flows like water and discharges itself into the great sea towards the west. I saw the great rivers, and came to the great river, and to the great darkness, and went to the place where no flesh walks. And I saw mountains of darkness of winter, and the place from which all waters of the deep flow, and I saw the mouths of all the rivers of the earth, and the mouth of the deep. So the Zohar is the key to understanding this river of fire. And it's very clear that the authors of the Zohar were familiar with the book of Enoch, because that's where they're drawing this river of fire from. And now you see why it's such a mistake to ban somebody from referencing the Zohar if they're going to be trying to interpret the book of Enoch, because the Zohar gives us a key to understanding the material of the book of Enoch as it was understood in Second Temple era Judaism. And that's something we should be striving to do. That would be very helpful information. It's a lot more helpful information than our guesswork on how to interpret it based on our modern sensibilities and culture. Chapter 18. And I saw the treasuries of all the winds. In other words, he's crossed over this fire, this river of fire that separates this world from the other world. I saw the treasuries of all the winds. I saw how he had furnished them with the whole creation and the firm foundations of the earth. And I saw the cornerstone of the earth, and I saw the four winds which bear the earth and the firmament of heaven. And I saw how the winds stretch out the vaults of heaven and have their station between heaven and earth. These are the pillars of heaven. And I saw the winds of heaven which turn and bring the circumference of the sun and all the stars to their setting. I saw the winds of the earth carrying the... No, let's talk about that for a minute. The word wind in Hebrew is ruach, which is really just an invisible force. So it's the only word you could use if you wanted to refer to invisible force. So what he's really saying is that he saw forces which caused the sun and all the stars to their setting. In a vision, which means these things are symbolic and not real world things that he's seeing. The river of fire is symbolic, it's not real. Okay, but it's our best way of perceiving these things. And I saw the winds of the earth carrying the clouds, and I saw the paths of the angels. And I saw at the end of the earth the firmament of the heaven above, and I proceeded and saw a place which burns day and night, where there are 7 mountains of magnificent stones, 3 towards the east and 3 towards the south. We'll read more about these mountains later. And as for those towards the east was a colored stone, and one of pearl and one of jacinth, and those towards the south of red stone. But the middle one reached to heaven like the throne of Elohim of alabaster, and the summit of the throne was as sapphire. And I saw flaming fire. And beyond these mountains is a region to the end of the great earth, and the heavens were completed. And I saw a deep abyss with columns of heavenly fire. And I saw in it the columns of fire fall, which were beyond measure, alike toward the height and towards the depth. And beyond the abyss I saw a place which had no firmament of the heaven above, and no firmly founded earth beneath it. There was no water upon it, no birds, but it was a waste and a horrible place. And I saw there 7 stars, like great burning mountains to me, when I inquired regarding them. Let's pause here. We have a handout on the 7 stars. First Enoch 18:13 through 16. Let's go ahead and finish this because I think it's helpful information to cover the whole thing. The angel said, "This place is the end of earth, of heaven and earth. This has become a prison for the stars and for the hosts of heaven." And the stars, which would fit with the Tartarus, by the way, and the stars which roll over the fire are they which have transgressed the commandments of Yahweh as the beginning of their rising, because they did not come forth at their appointed times. And he was wroth with them and bound them till the time when their guilt should be consummated for 10,000 years. This phrase 10,000 years in Hebrew, whenever that appears, even the number 10,000, it frequently just means a whole lot. All right. We're about to smash another Book of Enoch hoax. Oh, let's say hoax. Well, hoax, misunderstanding, certainly. First, let's talk about what the seven stars are, and then we're going to, uh, in our next handout, talk about the wandering stars. So the seven stars, whenever you see the reference to seven stars in ancient Hebrew literature, the word star has much broader meaning in Hebrew. It's kochav. It has a much broader meaning in Hebrew than in English. It really just means a heavenly body. It means a heavenly body. And in this case, a heavenly body is the star is uh, not just what we think of as stars. In fact, when we refer to the seven stars to the ancient Hebrews, that referred to the sun, the moon, and the five visible planets, of which they were aware of. They weren't aware of the planets that were too far for the human eye to see. So these were seven, what they called the seven stars, because they were wandering stars, because whereas all the literally millions of other stars, certainly thousands that could be seen with the visible eye, they all follow the same path over and over and over across the sky. And as the Earth spins, they're actually standing relatively still relative to the Earth, certainly within a human lifetime. But the Earth is spinning, so they appear to, from the Earth's frame of reference, since all motion is relative, they appear to follow the same path. However, the planets don't. They follow along the plane of the ecliptic, but they move around somewhat because they're also moving around the sun with enough speed relative to the Earth that we can detect that motion, and so that causes them to speed up and slow down and even backtrack, um, and so were known by the ancients as wandering stars. And we'll get to that next. But a couple of examples of ancient Hebrew literature referring to the seven stars. Zohar, Volume 1, page 188b. God has set seven stars in the firmament, and each firmament contains numerous angels appointed to minister to the Holy One. Blessed be he, each angel having his own service to perform before the Master. All attend to the service to which they had been appointed, and each one knows his task. Some of them serve as messengers, having charge in this world of the works of men, and others are appointed to chant to him songs and hymns. And the book known as the Sefer Yetzirah refers to the seven letters that are known, the seven Hebrew letters that are known as doubles: Beit, Gimel, Dalet, Kaf, Pei, and Resh, and Tav. They are likened to seven stars and which are identified with Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. In the Sefer Yetzirah, chapter 1, verse 2, and chapter 4, verses 1 and 17. Also in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, verses 16 and 20, and chapter 2, verse 1, we see reference to seven stars. And we'll talk about this more in chapter 52, verse 2. So let's talk about the wandering stars. And then I think we'll have to stop for today because we're gone up over an hour. I'd hope to get a little further, but we'll stop and then we'll pick up next week with chapter 19. Got some really interesting material in chapter 19, but we'll have to start there next week. So we just read these verses of chapter 18, verse 14. It says that talking about the stars, so-called wandering stars. Excuse me, I have allergies. The transgressed the commandment of Yahweh, according to verse 15, and they did not come at their appointed times, according to verse 15. So these wandering stars are misbehaving. There's some stars out there not doing what they're supposed to do. This is a big theme of the Book of Enoch, and it's a big reason that there's so much controversy about calendar issues in the Book of Enoch and later in the astronomical section. But we're going to jump ahead and see what this means. Jude chapter 1, verse 13b refers to wandering stars for whom is reserved blackness of darkness forever. These disobedient stars that did not come forth at their appointed times and transgressed the commandments of Yahweh. First Enoch chapter 41 verses 5 through 9 says, "And I saw the chambers of the sun and moon, whence they proceed and whither they come again, and their glorious return, how one is superior to the other, and their stately orbit." And then this is very important. "And how they do not leave their orbit, and they add nothing to their orbit, and they take nothing from it, and they keep faith with each other in accordance with the oath with which they are bound together." And we'll read about that oath which they are bound together. We read about it in First Enoch earlier in the Book of Watchers, that they took at Harmon, and that Mount Harmon, and we'll read about it later when we read about the oath that binds them in the Book of Parables around chapter 69, I believe. And then verse 6, the sun goes forth and traverses his path according to the commandment of Yahweh. So and I'll let you read the rest of this by yourself through verse 9. But the important thing here is that we have these angelic beings that are in charge of the movements of the heavenlies, and they're not doing what they were told to do. Well, here they are. In chapter 41 they are, but in chapter 80, verse 2 and 6, we read, "And in the days of the sinners the years shall be shortened." In other words, the lunar year, which did coincide with the solar year, starts to fall short. "And their seed shall be tardy on their lands and fields, and all things on the earth shall alter." All things on the earth shall alter, meaning the seasons are starting to hit in the wrong time, because the lunar year is falling short of the solar year, and so spring is happening earlier and earlier and starting to drift. What's supposed to be spring is drifting into what's actually winter. As it continues on, "And shall not, and all things on the earth shall alter, and shall not appear in their time," which is what they did not come forth at their appointed times in chapter 14, verse 15. Here it says, "shall not appear in their time." And then skipping to verse 6, "And many chiefs of the stars shall transgress the order prescribed, and these shall alter their orbits and tasks, and not appear at the seasons prescribed for them." Those disobedient angels, because of the calamity, in other words, a cosmic calamity, resulted from the fall of the angels that we've been reading about. That's the main theme of the Book of Enoch in chapter 6 and the Book of Watchers. These fallen angels that were disobedient, as a result, the heavenlies stopped moving the way they were supposed to, because these disobedient angels some of them were in charge of some of the heavenlies, and they weren't, when they went rogue, the heavenlies went rogue. And as a result, the lunar year started falling short of the solar year. And that caused calendar difficulties. This is key, because when people look to the astronomical section of the Book of Enoch and try and make a calendar out of it, the problem that we'll find when we get to the calendar section is it doesn't work. The whole point of the Book of Enoch is it doesn't work. It quit working. It's a ideal calendar of how the heavenlies were supposed to move and were moving prior to the fall of the angels in First Enoch chapter 6. But after the fall of the angels, sometime even before the flood, it's a pre-flood calendar. Um, the, uh, 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 the the calendar stopped working the way it was supposed to, and I believe, and I think that this is what we gather from the Book of Enoch, that just like the sun and the moon appear to be almost exactly the same size from the Earth, they're of radically different sizes, but by a strange coincidence, if you're an atheist, um, they are appear almost exactly the same size from Earth, and this is what makes both lunar eclipses and solar eclipses both possible. And part of the detailed design of the heavenlies and how they work by the Creator. I believe that originally the solar year and the lunar year, the 12 lunar month lunar year, coincided exactly. And that as a result of the disobedient angels in First Enoch chapter 6, and the whole event of the fallen angels that we read about in the book of Enoch, some of these angels were also responsible for some of the heavenly motions and some of the physical forces, if you will. And as a result of their disobedience, the heavenlies stopped moving the way they were supposed to, and the 12-month lunar year no longer coincided with the solar year, and so the lunar 12-month lunar year uh, uh, spring, if you will, harvest time was drifting into winter, and this doesn't work. It's perfectly good if you don't care about the seasons, but if you care about the seasons, you've got to plant at certain times and harvest at certain times, and they need to be the optimum times, and you need to be able to keep track of that. Then you've got a problem. And uh, and so that's the problem. And there have been many. It's not this isn't the first time. I think at Qumran there were those that were trying to make the Enoch calendar work without a comprehension or an understanding of the Book of Enoch. That this is presenting the ideal calendar that quit working when the heavenlies went into chaos, or somewhat into chaos. They're not completely in chaos, but they stopped functioning correctly and stopped moving according to how Elohim commanded them to move. When those heavenly beings in charge of them rebelled. All right. I had hoped to get into chapter 19, but I'm not going to get into that this week. We'll have to save that for our next study. So, in our next study, we'll begin in chapter 19, verse 1. I hope that you have learned some things and that you have a better understanding of chapters 14, 15, 16, 17, and 18 that we were able to cover today. Until next week, we'll pick up in chapter 19. Shalom, everybody.